This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Up to the early 19th century, Irish Catholic popular piety was significantly focused not on objects, such as statues, but instead on places in the landscape which had over time become associated with the sacred. Sometimes church ruins, but often natural features such as mountain summits, islands, lakes. Should I sit down? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Lakes, streams and springs, the latter generally referred to as holy wells, to the extent that Irish Catholic practice during this period has been described by more than one commentator as shapeless and non-figurative. In this respect, Irish pilgrimages differed from related Catholic devotional practices in other countries, where the focus was very often on man-made objects, particularly in countries such as Spain and Italy, where shrines featuring images of the Virgin, especially statues, were important. Now, this hand-coloured print from around 1841 shows an image of a pattern, a celebration of a saint's or patron's feast day in Connemara in the remote west of Ireland. Such events could attract thousands of people. Prayers and repetitive rounding rituals were mixed with eating, drinking, dancing, and frequently fighting. This is one of the main reasons that Irish pilgrimages and patterns were heavily criticised by both clerical and lay commentators because of their lack of control, their confusion of the sacred and the secular, and not just the secular but the not very respectable secular. By the mid-19th century, many patterns had been suppressed and their associated wells fallen into disuse, although those which still existed continue to attract many criticisms and expressions of anxiety. From the mid-19th century, the Irish Church, under the leadership of Cardinal Paul Cullen, focused its efforts to Romanise and standardise the behaviour of both its clergy and laity, to bring the Irish Catholic Church more in line with the decrees of the 16th century Council of Trent, which meant bringing Irish Catholic practice as much as possible into the church building. So therefore, to do this, it built more and bigger churches, giving the concept of Catholic Ireland an imposing material presence, but most importantly, ensuring that Catholic practice could be supervised and controlled within them as much as possible. It also introduced numerous devotions, so that Irish Catholics were constantly occupied with approved religious practices. Now, this is one of the more spectacular examples of these churches. It was begun in 1868. It is St. Coleman's Cathedral in Queenstown. It was known up until 1922, and it's now known as Cove. And this is the interior of the same church, very elaborately decorated. This is a photograph from around 1900. And apart from the main or high altar in this church, it contains 7 large neo-Gothic marble altars and 3 aisle shrines. Now, you can really only see the main altar here, and you can kind of glimpse on the far side there an altar through the pillars, but most of them are hidden because of the architecture. All these shrines and altars present devotional images in lavish settings. And it wasn't just cathedrals, big impressive cathedrals, that had this level of material display. This is the interior of a parish church in a town in the well-populated and prosperous East Midlands county of Carlow. And you can see the various devotional images here at the top of the church. You might be able to spot a Sacred Heart. You can see a Holy Family picture. There are 2 altars, one to the Blessed Virgin, one to the Sacred Heart, I think. And then there's Our Lady of Perpetual Succour. And then at the far end, there's a Pieta. You also had it in kind of more plain churches in poor, more impoverished areas. So this is, for instance, the interior of a church in a remote rural area of Donegal. And again, you can see we have the main altar, and you can see shrines on each side, and an extra devotional image here, a painting of Our Lady of Perpetual Succour. Also convent chapels, such as this one in Cashel in County Tipperary, and again you can see this kind of display here too. Now, these photographs all date from around 1900, and images are very evident, I think you'll agree, in the church-based Irish Catholicism which they present. They occupy altars, shrines, niches and pedestals, and they represent international Roman Catholic figures rather than Irish or local saints. Such images became an important and distinguishing component of Irish Catholic Church interiors at this time. They differentiated Catholic from Protestant churches. So if you walked into a church, one of the main reasons you knew you were in one or the other was the presence or otherwise of devotional images. Now, the images are presented in such a way that people are invited to approach and interact with them. They are set within elaborate surrounds which mark them as more significant than the other imagery in the church. Decorative or narrative images, for instance. They have a specific material presence and authority, but they are also accessible and inviting. People can approach them. They can leave flowers and plants, as you can see here. They can light candles, or they can often touch them as well. Some of them have seating or kneeling facilities nearby, as here. So even while the main image here, which is what they call a Pieta image, the sorrowing mother with Christ, the adult Christ, even though it's behind glass, there are still facilities for people to come and contemplate the image. Now, such images were also incorporated into outdoor locations, often the old sites of Catholic devotional practice, which, despite the reform programme, were still places of traditional pilgrimage for many. So here, for instance, a shrine with a Virgin and Child statue is built on the site of Ladies' Well in Woodford in County Galway. Orthodox form was therefore incorporated into what was previously a shapeless landscape feature, transforming it into something altogether more specific, more identifiably Roman Catholic, and more controlled. And here we have another one, a holy well in County Clare, previously dedicated to the 7th century local Irish saint Loughdeen, rededicated in the 19th century to Saint Joseph. Devotion to Saint Joseph was heavily promoted by the papacy during the 19th century, and in 1870 Pope Pius IX proclaimed him patron of the Universal Catholic Church. This holy well was framed, as you can see, by an architectural structure holding several images, the most prominent here being the statue of Saint Joseph in the upper niche. The whole is surmounted by 3 crosses. The change in the dedication of the well from the local Saint Loughdeen, about whom a mixed range of beliefs and practices would have accumulated over time, to the universal patron, Saint Joseph, shows how a modern international standardised orthodoxy was imposed on an older, local, less clear-cut and certainly less controllable tradition. And this is reinforced by the introduction to the site of mass-produced statuary representing Joseph and other papally endorsed figures. Now, some pilgrimages were deliberately revived, having been suppressed for so long. They were deliberately revived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, rehabilitated as part of the national Irish Catholic discourse. These, however, were very strictly controlled by the clergy, who often led pilgrimages and said outdoor masses as part of the event, and whose presence ensured there were none of the behavioural excesses which caused so much negative comment in earlier times. An example given by Diarmid Ó Giolán of such a revivified pattern is that at Croke Patrick, a mountain on the west of Ireland, which, quote, appears to have been moribund at the beginning of the 20th century when the Archbishop of Tuam had an oratory built on the summit so that Mass could be said there rather than in the ancient ruin of Temple Patrick. He and other church dignitaries began to lead the pilgrims annually, and by the mid-century it had become a national pilgrimage, end of quote. So patterns and pilgrimages were therefore largely co-opted by the church, and their more offensive elements were repressed. Now, most of the devotional imagery in Irish Catholic churches and in outdoor shrines during this period consisted of formulaic representations of a very narrow range of divine figures. It must be emphasised that this is the case in relation to devotional images only, those images with which Irish Catholics were specifically encouraged to interact through their particular placement and presentation in church interiors, and through a range of papally sanctioned devotions and prayers which proliferated during the 19th century. A much wider variety of divine figures, including Irish saints, featured in narrative and decorative panels and surrounds in Irish churches. The most common devotional images, by far, were papally promoted international ones, such as this one, Our Lady of Lourdes, a representation of the Virgin as she appeared to 14-year-old Bernadette Soubirous in 1858 in Lourdes in France. From the 1860s on, large outdoor imitations of the grotto at Lourdes, which included figures of both Bernadette and the Virgin, were commonly constructed in the grounds of schools, churches and convents. Another extremely common one was the Sacred Heart. This is from 1898, this statue group. An image based on a series of apparitions which took place in France from 1673 to 1675. A young nun, shown here, Saint Marguerite Marie, reported that she was visited several times by Christ, who displayed to her his burning and bleeding heart. Another very common one, as I've mentioned, is St. Joseph, promoted as a role model for fathers and working men throughout the Catholic world. And of course, the crucified Christ, central to Christian and Catholic devotion from early in its history. Now, mass production greatly facilitated the control of both the content and the style of this devotional imagery. Clergy could easily order what they wanted from a catalogue, such as this is a page from a catalogue from one of the biggest international ecclesiastical firms, Mayer and Company of Munich. Mayer and Company, which was founded in 1845 as the Institute for Christian Art, produced cast figures for domestic and foreign markets in a range of materials, sizes and prices. In 1892, Mayer and Company was awarded the title Pontifical Institute of Christian Art, and its note paper was headed Knighted by His Holiness Pope Pius IX and appointed by His Holiness Pope Leo XIII. So this company, therefore, was authorised and its products endorsed by the Church, so that potential buyers could be reassured that what they bought was safely within the bounds of orthodoxy. And this would go, I think, some way towards explaining the popularity of Mayer-type statuary in Irish churches, and not just in Irish churches, but this paper is focusing on the Irish situation. So, for instance, this is another page from the Mayer catalogue. So if a priest wanted to buy for his church an image of Our Lady of Lourdes, which you can see on the far left, or an Immaculate Conception, these two images here, which was another very popular one, he had plenty of choice. The model, for instance, on the far left came in a range of sizes: 6 foot, 5'7", 4'9", 3'8", or 1'6". It came in terracotta or zinc, and you could get it with or without Bernadette. But one thing he could be certain of: he would get exactly what he ordered from the catalogue. The figure would be clearly recognisable as Our Lady of Lourdes. There would be no ambiguities, no strange distractions. It would be perfectly familiar and perfectly orthodox, as well as cheap and quickly delivered. None of which could be guaranteed, for instance, with work commissioned from an artist. So style as well as content could be regulated and standardised. The spiritual beauty of divine beings, it was thought, should be expressed in religious imagery via beautiful, perfectly proportioned physical forms. Purchasers of devotional imagery for churches wanted it to elicit a sense of appropriately directed spiritual connection and emotional elevation in the viewer. This was thought to be best achieved by a combination of the lifelike and the beautiful, so that viewers would be convinced by the truth of what they were seeing, while being gently transported to a transcendent heavenly state by its idealisation. However, in a lot of the mass-produced imagery, idealisation developed into a sort of kitschy prettiness, which was despised by many, including some Irish commentators who saw themselves as aesthetically sophisticated. They despaired at the speed with which the previously empty interiors of newly constructed Irish Catholic churches were filling up with these images, because they seemed to have been very appealing to Irish Catholics and were enthusiastically adopted by them. They became woven into the newly constructed concept of Irish national identity, despite their completely non-Irish origins. To the extent that, in the early 20th century, prayers of thanks were given to Our Lady of Lourdes for preventing the introduction of conscription to Ireland during World War I. Revolutionary leaders repeatedly identified themselves with the crucified Christ, and their mothers with his mother, the Mater Dolorosa, or Sorrowing Mother, and men who were being executed for treason for attacking and killing members of the British police force offered up their lives in honour of the Sacred Heart. These images, therefore, through their material manifestations, although their material manifestations were generally cheap, they were mass-produced and they were imported, or maybe because of these qualities, became very powerful in Irish society. Because of the way they were promoted to Catholics both discursively, via devotional texts for instance, and through their physical settings such as shrines, which made them authoritative and accessible, and also because of their formal qualities, their familiarity, their consistency and their appeal. In the context of 19th century Ireland, they enchanted viewers, in the sense put forward by Alfred Gell in his book Art and Agency. leading to emotional responses which allowed them to exercise social agency. They caused things to happen. So, for instance, the writer Sean O'Whalon wrote of his childhood experience visiting this particular crucifixion in a church in Cork around 1900. Quote, "My mother often led me to pray at the tall crucifixion in the dim southwestern corner. She never failed to whisper to me that the Virgin's foot had performed many miracles of healing. The painted foot was worn to the white bone of its plaster by these pious rubbings." Unquote. A Jesuit priest, W.J. Lockington, who visited Ireland from New Zealand, commented on the interaction between Irish Catholics and devotional images. Quote, "It tore one's very heartstrings to enter those poor rooms of Irish homes, and by the flickering light of the shrine lamp, see Our Lady of Lourdes trying to comfort a poor widow as she kneels at the desolate hearth. And impossible as it may seem, Our Blessed Lady does accomplish this task." Now, Lockington's language makes very clear his actual sympathy with this, and indeed the fact that he too granted these images a powerful social agency. So too do the novels of another priest, an Irishman, Patrick Sheehan. Sheehan began writing popular realistic novels in the late 19th century as an effective way of educating and edifying the general public and communicating his ideas broadly on Irish Catholic life. Characters in his novels become enraptured with devotional images. An example of this is a narrator's description of a congregation's reaction to the introduction of a Christmas crib to a church. And, quote, "I heard gasps of surprise and delight, exclamations of wonder, suppressed hallelujahs of joy. I saw adoration and tenderness, awe and love on the dimly lighted faces of the people. Some were kneeling and uttering half-frantic ejaculations of adoration, pity and love. All around, the fervid Celtic imagination translated these terracotta images into living and breathing personalities." In another novel, a young priest is described as going into raptures over a picture of Our Lady. He studied it, gazed on it, and every throb of pleasure was a prayer. And in another, a character interacts emotionally and physically with a painting of Christ, gazing long and lovingly at this presentment of his divine master. Then he knelt down and pressed his forehead against the dust-stained feet of Christ, not the picture of Christ, the dust-stained feet of Christ, and moaned. In Sheehan's novels, encounters with devotional images appear to lead to developments in the narrative, such as the sudden dramatic change of mind on the part of a character or the curing of an illness. In other words, they have social agency. Now, some commentators, Catholic and non-Catholic, were uneasy with such a construction of the agency of devotional imagery. Since its foundation, the Church's support for the use of imagery has meant that it needed to be careful to avoid accusations of idolatry. Repeatedly, the acceptability of the symbolic veneration of images was emphasised, the honouring of what the image represents, but not the physical image itself. As was stressed in the Catholic Encyclopedia in 1910, the, quote, "obvious absurdity of addressing prayers or any sort of absolute worship to a manufactured image was prohibited, as was petitioning an image in any way." However, as W.J.T. Mitchell has commented, images have a surplus value, the result of their peculiar vividness and immediacy of aesthetic appeal, and this is manifested in their tendency to exceed all the strategies of containment that are brought to bear on them. So while the Church could successfully control their presentation, form and content, regulating how people actually interacted with devotional images was much more difficult. In an article written in 1906, a Father D. Deneen recalled a harvest scene he had witnessed some years before. Quote, "Suddenly one of the harvesters called attention to something passing along the road hard by. It was only a statue of Our Blessed Lady, which was being borne from one of the parish chapels to another, but it was uncovered, as it were, inviting reverence. All looked and saw, and to see was to fall upon their knees and pray." Now, Deneen approved generally what he regarded as the simple piety of these workers, but he nevertheless pondered the meaning of this incident. He asked, what view did these grand worshippers take of that statue passing by? Did they look upon it merely as a sacred symbol, a suggestion, an invitation to turn their thoughts towards her whose image it was supposed to bear? It may be that they really did, but to me they seemed, and still they seem, to look upon it as the mystic passing of their queen. Now, he acknowledged that it was easy to confuse the image with what it represents, the sign with the signified, and that this confusion did not detract from the genuine faith of the harvesters. However, he was less tolerant of what he called the teeming petitions with which the enshrined statues in Irish churches are constantly besieged. Considering the fact that the petitioning of images was forbidden and that many of these petitions were for causes of which the Church disapproved. So he asked, for instance, what would the Venerable Fathers of Trent have thought of the action of Catholics who, having developed a taste or a passion for betting, and having determined to gamble on a horse race, earnings which they can ill afford to misspend, enter the sacred temple of the Lord, light a candle at a shrine, and on bended knee dare to ask one of the saints of God, or even the Queen of Heaven herself, to direct their choice aright, or to crown their choosing with success. So, to conclude, the enchantment and agency of devotional images was effectively constructed and used by the Church as a means of reforming, controlling and standardising Irish Catholic practice, of making it respectable. Once constructed, however, it could not be easily or precisely controlled. As suggested here, it could exceed and indeed sometimes counteract the aims of the reformists. People interacted with these images directly without church mediation necessarily, and exploited their power for their own, not necessarily religious, agendas, sometimes even manipulating it against the very institution through which it was originally constructed.